Welcome back to the Brideson Show. Now, today I wanted to talk about long-term training planning and the different approaches and the different thought processes that go into it. Now, there's really two different ways that you can look at your planning. And the first one is looking at things from a top-down approach, where you're looking at, okay, I have an endpoint. How do I logically work towards that endpoint? So how do I break my training year or whatever specified amount of time that I have down into smaller chunks so that I can work towards that end goal? The other way of looking at it is from what we call a bottoms-up approach. Now, the bottoms-up approach is really building qualities that you want from the ground up and then working towards being more specific over time. And then once you get to a certain point, you might look at a top-downs approach. Now, this all sort of falls under the umbrella of a term that we call periodization. And really, the term periodization is essentially just planning. It's going, we have an endpoint and we want to work towards said endpoint. How do we get there? How do we plan it? How do we break it down into smaller logical chunks? Now, when we're looking at, say, a bottoms-up approach, for instance, there's really two sort of groups of people that fall into this bottoms-up approach. Now, the first one is someone who's entering the gym for the first time or entering the gym and they're following a structured strength training program. And the second group is a rehabilitation group. Now, with a bottoms-up approach, the unique thing about it is you're looking for outcomes and you're looking to build specific qualities. And as you achieve them or as the timeline allows, you progress your lifting or you progress your exercises or you progress your training. Now, I'm going to talk in a minute about that, about like how that actually looks for the different subgroups. And then when we look at someone that's, a little bit more experienced in the gym floor and, they might really want to dedicate like chunks of time to, say, building muscle mass, building strength, that's really when we start to look at these top-downs approaches. But really, when we look at all of it, all it is allocating a certain amount of time and allocating a certain amount of effort and specificity towards a certain section. Now, if we look at the bottoms-up approach and let's look at the rehab group first. Now, with a rehab group, so say for instance, someone has had hamstring surgery, high hamstring surgery, and they're dealing with the acute injury that essentially had happened and they've had surgery, it's all repaired, but now they want to get back into training. Now, the first part of their recovery process is a timeline of just allowing the stages of healing to occur. So those first, say, 6 weeks or 8 weeks may be very small in terms of actual training. But once you start to get moving, what you want to do is start to build up specific qualities. Now, the number one rule of someone that is coming back from surgery is do no harm. So do not injure or re-injure the area that has been operated on. So what we would look at doing in those particular cases is building up everything around the particular area that has been operated on. So if we look at a high hamstring, for instance, we would still want to have some activation or some training of the glute. We would still want to work on working on the quad, knee extension, hip flexion, anything on the lower body in terms of the shank, calf raises, tib ant raises. We would still want local muscle conditioning around the area itself, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that, we're not deconditioning ourselves. We want to make sure that the area that has been injured has had enough time or is given enough time to repair and do what it needs to do. But we want to make sure that we're kicking on and keeping moving forward with everything around it. So it's a perfect opportunity to really then dial in on the smaller, more isolated muscle groups. Now, if we look at this hamstring example, if you've got a high hamstring repair, you essentially just don't want to stress out the hamstring at the high end. So what you would look at doing is doing anything that essentially is bent knee hip extension would still work your hip extensors, it would still work your glutes, but it wouldn't put a huge amount of direct stress on the actual hamstring itself. Yes, there would be some muscle activation, but nothing that's probably going to be that detrimental to like the long-term recovery of the actual hamstring itself. Then if we go further downstream and we have a look at the actual calf itself, the calf, the gastroc specifically crosses the back of the knee joint. So having an active gastroc is actually going to help with that deceleration and that, slowing down of your femur and your tib and fib moving forward. So making sure that your calf is active and still building some strength, building some muscle mass during these recovery phases are really, really important. Now, you can look at the opposite side as well. If your hip extensors are inhibited, or there's inflammation there from the actual surgery itself, you're probably going to find that you're going to get overloading of other structures, say your hip flexors or your quads, because they're trying to do a little bit more work than they typically would, prior to the actual surgery, just because it's in it like a compensation pattern. So when we look at all of this, what we're actually doing is building the base, and we're building from a bottom up. So we're going, okay, let's work around the injured area and let's build all the qualities that we possibly can whilst the actual injury is recovering. And then as the timeline from the injury actually, gets longer and longer, say at 12 weeks, you're allowed to start to do an active muscle contraction of the hamstring, then we haven't wasted any time with any of the other muscle groups. So that is a real benefit of a bottoms up approach for someone in rehab. And, for the upper body, the core, and, everything else, you can continue to train as normal. So we're basically allocating a certain amount of time, because time is one component and then outcome is another component from a rehab. So the bottoms up approach really works well for that. Now, for a newer lifter in the gym, your biggest focus is essentially getting really solid foundation of technique dialed in, really building some training principles that you can then create a platform to then build on afterwards. So the goal is to build movement competency. So you're going to have a huge focus on your technique, and you're not going to start someone on a really complex exercise because it just doesn't make sense. What you would rather start is from a really regressed exercise where, you learn all the smaller components of training. You learn how to use your hips, you learn how to use your hamstrings, you learn how to use your quads, and you do it in a way that's really isolated, that's not too nuanced, and that you can get in and just get some really constructive work done. Now, how that would potentially look in practice is, you have your A1 and your B1, your main exercises of a training program. They're more skill focused. You're not going to be sitting at sets of 12, sets of 15 and absolutely driving fatigue in those particular exercises, because what you want to be doing is actually upregulating your nervous system. You want to be building movement qualities that are, really going to set that platform moving forward. So if you're squatting, for instance, if someone has never trained in the gym before, they can do a really nice bodyweight squat. You might start as far back as a goblet squat and then move someone into a safety bar squat. And as they get good at these movements, you progress as able. But you want to make sure that, the people that we're working with are actually ticking the boxes in terms of actual competency of the movement, especially with these A1 and B1 exercises. Then when you're looking at your accessory-based exercises for someone that's new in the gym, you would actually be looking at just putting someone on a machine or something that you can really feel the intended muscle group. I'm not going to do, crazy high rep stability work on someone that still hasn't got a lot of motor control over their body. I'd rather put them on a leg extension or a hamstring curl or a leg press or something that they can really get a meaningful benefit out of, because you're building the qualities. And the first stages of actually building these qualities is getting a really solid and, defined mind-muscle connection. Because if you don't know how to control your body, you don't know how to use it, it's going to be very hard to then progress those things as you move down. So you want to build the qualities that you want from the bottom up. Now, a really logical way of that for someone that's new into the gym is start with an isolated exercise as their accessories. Hamstring curls, leg extension, calf raises, hip flexion-based exercises, bent knee hip extensions or hip thrusts. You're going to start off with exercises which really just push the tissues that you want to actually build up. Then you could progress that into, say, single leg stuff, unilateral base work to work on balance and symmetry, and then move into something like leg presses, hack squats, stuff like that. But you can see how the progression builds as the training program builds as well. So that is kind of the two main areas that I would, the groups that I would actually use a bottoms up approach for. Now, let's talk about top-down's approach, and I want to show you how they sort of work together as well. Now, with a top-down approach is you're looking at someone that's more advanced, right? You're looking at someone that's, they've got a really good sound base of movement competency. They might not necessarily have any sort of like big injuries that they're dealing with or anything like that. And you just want to dedicate time to a particular area. Now, I've spoken about this in previous podcasts, but if my main outcome was to build muscle mass, I would probably want to spend 2/3 of my year actually working on muscle mass, and I would still want to dedicate some time to strength as well. But when you're looking at it from a top-down approach, it's very easy to go, okay, so January, February, March, I'm going to spend that particular time just building a base level of strength, work on my movement and competency, and sort of essentially deload my body. I don't want to do too much stress there, because the back end of the year, I know that I'm going to be pushing a lot of training volume because my main outcome is hypertrophy. So I'm going to be pushing a lot of sets and reps. So I want to build like a really nice strength foundation at the start of my training that's essentially going to set that platform to move forward. So the top-down approach allows me to go, okay, well, those first 3 months, this is what type of training I'm doing. And then for the back end of the year, that's what I'm going to do with my training. I'm going to, these are the different types of set and rep structures I'm going to use. These are the different types of training methods that I'm going to use. And you can allocate different training phases to it in, a sequential, logical way. Now, that is probably like when you think of someone that is a powerlifter, you think of someone at the Olympics, this is essentially all they do. They have an endpoint and they're working back from that particular endpoint. Now, here's the thing. You don't want to get stuck in the trap of always just looking for an endpoint as well, because at a certain point in time, people's training just becomes training. You want to train for an outcome. Yes, you want to build muscle mass. Yes, you want to build strength, but it's a lifestyle. It's something that you're adding into your life that you're doing because you enjoy it, because there are so many benefits of actually doing so. So when you move into, say, like more of a lifestyle approach with your actual training itself, you actually want to have a combination of all these things in your training happening. So how I would potentially look at it is the first part of your training year, right? You could look at it as a general preparation or a bottom-up approach phase where I spend, say, 2 blocks at the very start of the year working all the isolated, working movement competency, and working from the ground up. And say my outcome was to be put on as much muscle mass as I can by the end of the year. You set this really nice foundation with a bottoms-up approach. And then that's when you bring in the tops-down approach. And you go, okay, so now for the remainder of my year, I'm going to spend the next 2 blocks in strength, and then I'm going to dedicate the rest of my block into building muscle mass, the rest of the end of the year into building muscle mass. And you can see then when we're actually using all the different approaches within that full term of the year, and you're spending time building the isolated stuff, you're building the movement competencies up, which means that is inherent built, injury prevention, essentially, because you're not forgetting any part of your training program. Then you're building strength, and then you're using that strength platform and taking that strength into your hypertrophy platform. So when we're looking at long-term training program, if you're looking at someone that's more of a lifestyle approach, you want to have a really vast amount of tools in your toolbox to use. When you're looking at a powerlifter, you still want to use these types of training processes. I think the more common word that people are sort of using in the powerlifting industry at the moment is like variability or conditioning blocks, right? But really all you're thinking about doing is you're building some local conditioning to tissue, you're working on movement technique, you're building up isolated movements. So regardless of what you're training for, and regardless of where you come into that particular journey, you're just going, okay, where am I? Am I focusing on building up, or am I focusing on looking at from the top down? And that is all under the umbrella of what we call periodization. So really when we're looking at long-term planning or you hear the word periodization, all it's saying is it's breaking down chunks of your year into specific outcomes, and then you're working towards them and then moving towards a specific goal. But depending on where you are, you might have to build up from the ground to get to that particular point. Now that's it for today. I'll see you guys on the next episode.